Evening, everyone. So today, what we're going to be mostly talking about is this this latest reports that the Tories reckon they can pull an absolute blinder when the general election is called, which I still expect to be more likely for May than November, and how, as in one report, they are planning for 2 general elections this year. 2. So we'll go through that. But what I will do first, because it's not a totally related question, but we may as well do it anyway, because it's been very much in the news this week. So there's a couple of questions here about Labour's £28 billion green investment pledge. So I'll read out the 2 questions, then I'll go through really quickly. And then if you want more details, I can talk about that later on as well. So first, thoughts on Labour scrapping their £28 billion flagship green investment plan? And the second question is phrased, do I have any insights into why Labour scrapped their investment? So they haven't touched it. It's not changed at all in the slightest. So let me explain what has happened. What's happened is Labour announced this £28 billion green investment, right? It was probably stupid to put a figure on it. Instead, what they should have done is say, we've got this policy, and they talked about, for example, one of the big policies in it is the Great British Energy. So there's various things like that involved and as part of it. And Labour should have just talked about those policies. They should have just said, we're going to have a policy to do this, 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 and this, right? But they didn't. They lumped it all together in this £28 billion a year green investment plan. Then, of course, what happened last year is after Liz Truss blew a massive hole in the finances, the country's finances, Labour said, oh, well, we might not be able to start with £28 billion a year straight away. I strongly suspect they will, by the way. But they had to say that so that they don't get accused of spending money that they haven't accounted for, right? And that happened last summer. I think it was June or July last year. And since then, it hasn't changed at all. But what's happened more recently is because people are still going on about this 28 billion, like, well, is it going to be 28 billion? What's it going to be? When are you going to get it up to? And Keir Starmer said, well, it's our ambition to get it up to 28 billion pounds a year. We may have to wait until the second half of the Parliament. Well, how much? I don't know. It might, like, people are quibbling about whether it's 25 billion, 26 billion, 28 billion, 29 billion. Might be more. So all that's happened now is Labour have got, and I think this is a mistake, by the way. I think they've made a mistake. I'd have just doubled down on it. But they've allowed, they got so sick of it. It's a bit like a year or two ago when Keir Starmer couldn't walk into an interview without someone asking him what a woman was. And they just got sick of it. And they've got sick of this again. They keep being asked about the 28 billion thing. And it's like, well, we keep saying, Keir Starmer said as recently as Thursday, yes, it is still our ambition. So the fact that The Guardian publish a report based on unattributable, like, The Guardian aren't even claiming that Keir Starmer said this. They're claiming that some staffers have said this, right? So Labour have just got sick of it and they're saying, look, we wish you'd never mentioned the £28 billion. We're just going to focus on the individual policies that make it up. So the reality is that not a single one of their green investment policies has been removed. Not a single one of their green investment policies is having reduced funding because Labour didn't have £28 billion worth of green investment policies anyway. The green investment policies they've already announced amount to, I think it's about £10 billion. So there was like another £18 billion sort of going to be available for suitable investments, but there was no plans for it, right? So all Labour are doing, oh Christ. Oh no, someone said sound. I thought I was muted. I'm going, oh no, I've been talking for 5 minutes. I'm not muted. You're not right. Behave yourself. I think it was a cautionary one. So yeah, so that's what's happened. I still think Labour have made a mistake because now look what's happening. The Guardian are saying, oh, they're basically cancelling their £28 billion investment plan, which they're not. And then all the useful idiots are going on about, oh, you can't trust Labour with anything. I don't mean the Tories, by the way. I mean the useful idiots who like the idea of the green investment plan. They're all going, oh, well, they're not going to do it. Why am I going to bother voting for them? It's like, yes, they are still going to do it. So I'll if people want to talk about that more towards the end, that's absolutely fine. But the reality is the policy hasn't changed. The rhetoric has changed. I think Labour is still making an arse of their comms. But the policy hasn't changed. The policy has never changed, not once. And all I will say is, in 2 years' time, when we come back to this, I strongly suspect I will be able to say to people, there it is. But anyway, on to, because before anything happens, before Labour can do anything, they need to win the general election. So it's again what the Tories are trying to do to put themselves in the best position for the general election, right? So it's been clear for some time the Conservatives are not going to win the general election. So there's a few people, you know what, people will know what I'm like. I use Twitter not to build an audience. I use it to listen to people. Although maybe I should try and build an audience there as well. And one of the things, so I try and follow experts so that I'm not, this is why it would be distressing to me if Twitter did disappear up Elon Musk's arsehole, right? Because I follow a lot of proper experts. So usually when there are times when I do a video on something and then it's in the mainstream media 2 days later, because I've already been following the experts who can give you the lowdown on it, so I don't have to wait for the mainstream media to write an article on it. A lot of the time I do. I still obviously read a lot of newspaper articles. But so some of those experts I follow have the lowdown on what's really going on in CCHQ. And the lowdown is that they're basically in election mode now. There's a level of activity within CCHQ, by the way, is Conservative Campaign Headquarters. It's their sort of brain, such as it is. It's their strategy base. And it is on election footing. It is not, you don't get activity like this if we were still 9 months out from the election. So they are definitely gearing up for May, and there's lots of other, I've gone over various reasons why it's quite clear they're aiming for May as well. But I've also said it's the they've got an off ramp for November if it goes wrong. And I was thinking, because their tax plans don't seem to be working at the moment, I'm thinking I'm actually increasing the probability of a November election, even though I still think May is more likely. So then you have this article in the I newspaper. Now, obviously, take any newspaper in the mainstream media with a massive wheelbarrow of salt, yeah? But they're saying here, Tories planning for 2 back-to-back general elections. Well, why would that be? So what the article basically suggests is the Tories reckon they can beat Labour down to, they recognise now that they can't win outright, but they reckon they can get Labour to a point where they don't have a very strong majority and will have to trigger another election later on in the year. Now, let's just go a few things here. So it says here, I'll read out some snippets from the article. It's free. I haven't actually put a link below. I should put a link below later on for those not watching live. Tory party strategists are privately planning for 2 general elections in quick succession amid a growing belief that the first result could be tied to the national opinion polls suggest. Right, so this is what national opinion polls suggest. They suggest the Conservatives on 111 seats and Labour on 467 seats. Yes, I think the results could be tighter than that. Do you know what? The Tories could win double those number of seats and still be a long way off Labour having a weak majority, right? So this is an absolute nonsense situation. Yes, there's a good chance the results will look better than that for the Conservatives, although if we can really fire up people for tactical voting. Because actually, I don't mind articles like this. Articles like this are trying to paint it as if the Tories could make it close. That's brilliant, because that'll get more people out. Because there's, I worry about apathy for tactical voters going, well, there's no real need for me. There's several reasons why I think they still should. But so articles like that, I ain't got a problem with them, but they are just wrong. So yes, I think there'll be lots of time. Now there's another little interesting graphic in the Times. Where is it? Here it is. So this shows, so what we've got here is basically a chart of this is purely the poll lead between, or the polling gap between Labour and the Conservatives going right back to 1951, okay? Now, if it's a dark blue bar, it means the Conservatives actually won that general election. If it's a light blue bar, it means they lost, okay? Obviously beige at the bottom because we don't know the result, and maybe it's beige because they think that Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak are boring. I don't know. Billy Connolly always used to use the term beige for boring middle-class people, didn't he? I wonder if they're Billy Connolly fans, whoever created this chart. But what we can see is, so in terms of like Conservative like wins from a losing position, you're looking on the left-hand side. So in 1951, they had a 1 point deficit, as they're calling it, but I'm gonna correct that in a bit, over Labour, and they still won. In 1955, it was a 6 point deficit. They won. In 1987, it was a 4.5 point deficit. So they were behind Labour. This is, by the way, 10 months out from the election. I will just point out we are definitely not 10 months out from the election. We may, in theory, be 9, not 10. But we're not going to quibble over a month. And then the big one, 1992, when there was a 6.7 point, Labour basically had a 6.7 point lead over the Conservatives, and the Conservatives still won. Now, there's a couple of things I will point out here. First of all, what it's showing is the Conservatives have never overturned more than a 7 point deficit here. I mean, you can see 1964, the Conservatives were 10.2 points behind. They couldn't overturn it. 1974, 10.4. They actually came close, actually. That was a really weak Labour government. They had hardly a majority at all. But nonetheless, they couldn't overturn it. 1997, there was a 21.8 point gap. They did not overturn that. They didn't get anywhere close to it. 2001, it was 16.6. 2005, it was 2.7. That was really close, 2.7, and they still couldn't even overturn that. This is 10 months out. So now they're saying 20.2 for Labour. But the other thing I will point out, because you may look at this and you may go, okay, Labour had a bigger gap over the Tories in 1997. No, they didn't. Because it's not just about Labour and the Conservatives. In terms of who forms the government, yeah, okay, it is. But in terms of votes, it's not. In the 1990s and the 1980s, when it comes to it, over 80% of, when you looked at voting intention polls, over 80% of the votes were going to either Labour or the Conservatives, right? Now, it's not even 70%. Like, what is it at the moment? Let's just have a quick look. At the moment, you've got, I think it's 69%. 69% say they're going to vote either, this is on the poll of, I've done this on the average poll of polls rather than an individual one. 69% say they'll vote for either Labour or the Conservatives. In the 90s, it was over 80%. Like, it was over 80%. The vast majority of the rest would be the Lib Dems, and really small numbers who would vote Plaid or SNP or some other party, or Green Party, say. Whereas now, some of those other parties, smaller parties, do attract more votes. Okay? So a 20-point lead now is worth more than a 22-point lead in 1997. So they're not going to overturn it. So on current form. So the question is, what are they planning? Are they planning something really evil, like proper Trump-level insurrection evil, or are they just incredibly deluded? I strongly suspect it's a mixture of the two. I've said before, I think they're going to create themselves, they're going to fight the dirtiest, nastiest, most illegal campaign we've ever seen. And some of the things that would be illegal now won't be illegal because they're passing legislation at the moment to allow themselves to run a dirty campaign without it breaking the law as well. So, you know, that That's what the Conservatives are doing at the moment. They're not legislating to improve people's lives. They're not legislating to try and ease the cost of living or to deal with rising crime or anything like that. No, they're passing legislation to make it easier for them to win the election. That is what they're currently doing, right? So yeah, it's so I do think they're planning on doing something incredibly dirty. At the same time, I also think they're being incredibly stupid because they think, doesn't matter what the poll lead is now for Labour, they think that as soon as the election campaign starts, they're going to make serious headway. Because if this article is accurate, and I cannot possibly tell whether it is accurate or not, if it is accurate, they are in for a rude awakening because there is absolutely nothing here. Nothing at all. And just because in a situation like this, you'll always be thinking to yourself, surely the Tories can't be this stupid. Even though Tory MPs can, their paid professional strategists cannot be this bad. So we turn to Ben Walker, who is a pollster and a journalist. And this is what he tweeted in response to this very article. So he said, I'm reminded of journalists tweeting 5 minutes to the exit poll in 2017 that Tory strategists were telling them they're expecting to win 380 seats. They did not win 380. This is when Theresa May lost her majority. Now, what that says is journalists were talking to Tory strategists, and those Tory strategists on the day of polling, when the polls were about to close, still thought they were going to win a large majority, which is what they wanted to do, right? I have to say, pollsters did not think they were going to win a large majority. In fact, YouGov pretty much nailed the results pretty closely anyway. So it's a so it is possible for the Conservatives to hire strategists that actually aren't very good, is what I'm saying. So we cannot discount the article on the basis that the Tory strategists couldn't be this stupid, because they can. So then you try and look for, so why do they think that they're going to be able to go from a 20-point, particularly if they're aiming for May, because you know, they are aiming for May. It doesn't mean it's say it's definitely in May, but they're aiming for May. Might be earlier, maybe it'd be April. I saw one suggestion that they might even want to call the election at the end of this month, which means they could do it for April. I'd be very surprised. I think it makes more sense strategically for the Conservatives. I've said this before. So they're going to announce the budget on the 6th of March, which is early, and that gives them then 3 weeks to gauge public reaction to it. And that way, if they're happy with the public reaction to it, call the election on just before they go into Easter recess, call the election then on like the 25th or something of March, and they can have their May 2nd election then. Or if they look at it and go, yeah, that hasn't worked, panic and call it long, although they'd still be better off actually, ironically, calling it for May. So it's really weird. I'll tell you what I had a thought of with this article in terms of what it might be. Because it occurs to me, if the Conservatives are planning on a May election, and it would be mad to call that election when you're so far behind in the polls, you might your MPs might have something to say about it, yeah? Even though in theory there's not a lot they can do about it. But if they get the inkling that he's about to call it, they may, say, no, we're not having this. What if articles like this are a deliberate ploy by the Tory strategists to get, not to con the public, not to inform the public certainly, but to con their own MPs, to say to their own MPs that we're going to call the election and it's going to look like we're on for a right pounding, right? But we're not, because we've got this secret plan. And as soon as the election's called, we're going to go into our secret plan and we're actually going to make it really tight. Because you look at some of the reasoning here and it's absolutely ludicrous. So the main rationale for this plan of the double general election, right, is So here's how they think it's working in their heads. So they say, according to this report. So the election's called, the election's fought. They don't win it. Of course they don't win it. They're too far behind. But Labour are beaten down to a small majority. So, okay, it's a weak majority. Labour are going to struggle to pass a lot of their legislation. Fine. Why do they think Labour will call a general election? It must only be because they think Labour rebels will sink their own government. Now, here's the thing. Obviously, if Starmer only had a small majority, yes, we know that Labour rebels would try and use their leverage to change certain policies, to move certain policies very far to the left. Definitely, absolutely. But how does it help them to, after they've been in opposition for 14 years, right, at this point, come May, they've been in opposition for 14 years. They've watched the utter devastation of a Tory government. How does it make sense for any Labour MP to say, actually, what we want is to have another general election and give the Conservatives a chance of winning this time? Because what would happen in that second general election, the Conservatives, just like they did in 2015, and 2019, in fact, would say Labour cannot win a majority. And they'll have the proof now. They'll go, well, they will have had a majority, but not a workable one. Look, Labour cannot govern. The only way you can have a strong government is with the Conservatives. So you can see the Tory plan. But why? There's not a single Labour MP. There are some dim Labour MPs, but there's not a single one that dim that they would actually sink their own government. Like in the 1970s, Labour had a really weak majority, like 3 MPs or something stupid. And yet they still lasted until 1979. And, you know, I know people say they should have gone in 1978, but they lasted until 1979. So there's no reason to call an election under those circumstances. But anyway. So yeah, I'm now thinking that an article like this is a deliberate ploy to convince Tory MPs that they've got a plan so that they don't rock the boat. So I'm now starting to think, is the plan here, so to call the election in May, come what may, if you pardon the pun, and just in order to stop their MPs panicking, say, no, we've got this really great plan, right? Really great plan. Whereas in reality, they don't care. They're just going to get the election out of the way because they've done what they wanted to do. But anyway, it feels like the longer they wait, the fewer seats they'll end up with. Well, that's my view. Not just in terms of the time, in terms of things that are happening. So if they don't call the election for May, that means the earliest they can realistically do it, I mean, they could do it in theory in June or July. Why would you? Because if you don't call it in May, you are going to go through some bruising local election results. Just like we've had for the past few years. There's going to be another pounding in the local elections. You don't go to the general election straight after that. That'd be madness. So if you're not going to go on May the 2nd, it means you're going to go in autumn. So that means either October or November, right? And that means over summer, who knows what happens to channel crossings? You know, it's dependent on the weather. They're basing a strategy on look of the weather. And then the standards controls, which I want to talk more about over the next week, you know, even though I don't expect a lot of them to actually take place, there's still standards controls coming in. Well, there's already some coming. That's going to have an effect. So there's probably going to be shortages to deal with. And then you've got the ETIAS problem coming if they don't have it until, say, mid-November. Why wouldn't Labour form a coalition government? Because, so, right, I'll explain why. Let me put up this seat forecast. So, this is based on the poll of polls. Now, it has the Lib Dems on 33 seats. Now, okay, realistically, with a lot of tactical voting, the Lib Dems could gain a lot more seats. I mean, that's one reason, you know, to get the tactical voters out. And every one of those extra seats that the Lib Dems would win over what this is saying is a Tory gone. It's a Tory MP picking up their P45, right? But 33 seats. Now, think about it the other way, okay? If the Conservatives can actually beat Labour down to a small majority, it won't just be by denying Labour seats, it will be by denying Lib Dem seats as well. The Lib Dems will not have enough MPs to form a coalition, because it doesn't matter what's in a scenario where the Lib Dems do have enough MPs, the Conservatives have hardly any and Labour have a massive majority. In a scenario where Labour don't have a massive majority, the Lib Dems have hardly any MPs, and they can't, you can't. They could prop them up. Don't get me wrong. The Lib Dems could be like the DUP to Theresa May. They could prop them up, but they can't provide enough votes. There is no scenario that looks like 2010. Because on that occasion, it was the outgoing Labour government that were just losing seats all over the place. This time they're bringing them back. There are various other things that make me think as well that this article is deliberately to try and con Tory MPs. Partway through it said, I've forgotten where it is now, but it said somewhere that, actually, there's a lot of seats where Labour don't have a very large lead. And it mentioned there's even some red wall seats where Labour have only got a lead of 3 points. And I thought, okay, right, well, let's have a look at this. Let's get rid of this. So let me put this up. I'm going to show you stats, I'm afraid. My apologies. So this is the Excel spreadsheet. This is the YouGov MRP poll that they did a few weeks ago, right? This was the big 14,000 sample MRP. You're not going to tell me the Conservatives have got a more accurate version of this. Now, granted, this was over like a month, from basically over December. Things can change, but we can see from the overall polling situation, they haven't really changed in the Conservatives' favour, and they haven't really changed that much anyway. Now, if I look here, there are no red walls, because I've done a bit of analysis myself in terms of working out like the polling advantages and disadvantages with Labour, Lib Dems and the SNP over the Conservatives. And there are no red wall seats where Labour have either 3% gap or give or take even, not even 4%. The closest I could find was Grimsby, where I used to live for many happy years. Well, not all of them happy. Great Grimsby and Cleethorpes. This is a red wall seat. This is absolutely a red wall seat. And it's a red wall seat where on this MRP poll, Labour only have a 6-point lead. Now, you could absolutely attack that. The Conservatives could definitely attack that. Yes, certainly. If you get a load of don't knows voting Conservative and you don't get a lot of tactical voting Labour, yeah, I could see the Conservatives targeting Grimsby. But in terms of red wall seats, there are really not very many. You've got Scarborough and Whitby, similar thing, 6%. Okay, there are a few, but they're not easy, and there's really not very many. And, if you look at, so I'm going down. If you look at the number of seats where Labour have a lead over the Conservatives at the moment, it's a lot of them. So where I've done this in order of Labour lead. So anything up to naught is like level pegging with someone, well, the Conservatives specifically, actually. So it's like down to 220 seats where Labour either have a deficit or are on par with the Conservatives, according to this poll, which means well over 400 seats they're in the lead. Now, it doesn't mean to say they'd win all of those, because, there's this one, for example, Inverness, Skye and West Rossshire, where although Labour have a lead over the Conservatives, the SNP have a massive lead over everyone, so they will probably still retain the seat. So they're not all Labour seats being predicted. But, once you've gone past 10%, you're not really going to target it. It's absolute nonsense. Can Tory MPs want to cling to power for as long as possible if they've given up on winning? Some, yes, but again, you've got to bear in mind the Conservatives as a whole need their party to win as many seats as possible. There will be selfish MPs who just think, I will just have a few more months of MP's salary. But when you consider actually a lot of Tory MPs are wealthy, and they've not become wealthy just by being MPs, they are wealthy. there are a lot of Tory MPs, an extra 15, 20 grand is really not that much for them. They're not that bothered. And it's in the interests of their party to maximise the number of seats they can win. So I think the issue is not so much individual MPs going, I'd like an extra few months of salary. There will be some like that. Lee Anderson, top of the list, I should imagine. But I think mostly it will genuinely be strategic. It's just that if Rishi Sunak says to his MPs at the end of March, let's say the gap is still about 21%, and he says to his MPs, right, I'm calling the general election now, they'll go, are you mental? Are you off your head? So that's why I think this article exists. I think it exists to basically say to Tory MPs, oh, it'll look like the maddest thing you've ever seen in your life, but we've got a cunning plan. No, they haven't. What I would say is this. So the Tory strategists are trying to claim that over the, 6-7 week period of a general election campaign, that they can turn around a 20-point deficit into something like a 6-point deficit or something. Because remember, 6-point deficit could still mean that Labour have a tiny majority, right? So they're trying to claim that. I would say to them, if you could do that in 6 or 7 weeks, why couldn't you close the deficit at all in 13 months? Because the polls have not really narrowed. If I go back on this poll of polls, if I go back to last January, Labour had a 21-point lead on poll of polls, the Politico poll of polls. Today, they have a 21-point lead. I mean, it has gone up and down a little bit. But it is basically 13 months, 21-point lead at either end of those 13 months. I'm going to suggest that the strategists that could not get those polls to shift in 13 months are not going to get them to shift appreciably over the general election campaign. I do believe they are going to close, no, I don't know that they'll close the polls because tactical voting can go the other way as well. I believe that they might be able to close the polls a bit on the basis of two things. First of all, dirty tactics, incredibly dirty tactics. And the fact that as soon as the election is called, all Tory MPs have to swing behind Rishi Sunak. They've got no choice. All the Tory media ultimately have to do the same thing. Whether they will is another matter because they seem more intent on focusing on the leadership to follow. But ultimately, if they want the Tories to do well, they need to get behind them. And there's the don't knows. Now, there is a suggestion that the Tories are heavily expecting the don't knows to come out and to vote Conservative. The problem with this is there just aren't enough. There are not enough of them. Even if an inflated number of don't know, former Tory voting don't knows were to hold their nose and vote Conservative, which may well happen, there's not enough of them to make much of a dent in this. So there is absolutely no reason to suggest that the polling position right now can even turn itself into a small, weak Labour majority. Lee Anderson could just get a third job feeding Ed Davis some baked beans or something if he can't afford his 30p meals. Well, I mean, he'll hope that his GB News gig carries on. What I would say about that, see, I don't know what his viewing figures are. I think Barb has viewing figures, but you have to be a subscriber to be able to get them. So unless the media decides to report viewing figures, I don't know what his viewing figures are. I can't imagine they're very good. They started off tentatively and they nosedived after he fed Brendan Clark-Smith beans, right? So it's, what's the Banbury and North Oxfordshire prediction? Oh, right, okay. Hang on, I'm going to have to put the constituencies back in alphabetical order. I've taken it off the thing, but I've still got it open. So what are we looking at? Banbury. Oh, is that Kemi Badenoch's seat? That sounds familiar. Banbury and North Oxfordshire. That sounds familiar. Is that Kemi Badenoch? Oh, at the moment, I think on this one it's just Banbury, so I think it just changes to Banbury. So it might be Banbury and North Oxfordshire at the moment. It's just going to anyway. The prediction is it's actually neck and neck. It's a too close to call, but they're shading it for Labour. But the MRP, remember, that was based over December. Technically, polls have worsened since for the Conservatives. Have the Conservatives and Labour both on 34%. So that would be an interesting one. So it's probably not Kemi Badenoch. Oh, Kemi Badenoch, Saffron Walden. I was going to say if it's this close, I know Kemi Badenoch is in a safe one. Who's Banbury? Banbury has a new seat with more villagers. Yeah, well, this is probably why. It's more likely to. It's like so tight. It may be one of those. If it had retained the boundary, the old boundaries, it may have been a more solid Labour chance. That being said, how many Conservatives will hold their nose and vote Conservative, that the don't knows, and how much tactical voting will there be? You know, tactical voting is there's several unknowns in the general election campaign, and tactical voting is one of them. Can people be fired up to promote tactical voting? I need to crack on and carry on with my videos on reasons to tactical vote for various people as well. Lee could do a show called Challenge Anderson. He has a helicopter and mission. Oh, so for those who don't remember, there was a show in the 80s called Challenge Annika Rice. Oh, I used to like it. It's quite good. He has a helicopter and has missions to feed starving communities with cheap batch cooking. Yes, he may well poison quite a lot of them. Maybe send them to the Banbury villagers. They'll be too ill to go out and vote. The seats that's planning primaries for Tories, if there are enough independent candidates and Lib Dem support and confidence. Yeah, I mean, well, there's lots of local initiatives to try and overturn Conservative majorities where they seem even now to be bedded in. Like, if I was to, like, there's several arguments to vote tactically, and if I was to argue for like one of them, for people who think there's no point because they're in a really safe Tory seat, even now, I would still say this. Even if it is the case that with plenty of tactical voting, the Conservative still wins it. And I will point out that on this MRP poll, not a single Conservative seat has very much of a, you know, if I do this by Conservative, again, I've taken it off the thing. I'll put it back on actually for this because this might be interesting. So if I do this purely by Conservative share, like the safest seats, well, they're not the safest because it's not necessarily the largest, but in terms of the greatest vote share, right? Places like Brentwood and Ongar, 40% Conservative share. Now, here's the thing. If you look back at any general election results, certainly over the last few decades, there'll always be plenty of Conservative seats where the MP wins more than 50% of the vote. In other words, tactical voting wouldn't have done anything because they always won more than 50%. They can't lose that seat. The greatest vote share they have on this MRP model is 40%. There's like 5 seats there on 40%. So that tells you there is not a single seat that the Conservatives could not lose with tactical voting. You just have to be aware of what the tactical vote is. You know, that's really all there is to it. So, yeah, it's like, I would push that message quite strongly. If you think you're in a really safe seat, you're not. But let us say that the tactical voting isn't strong enough. You go out and to vote tactically. You're still reducing that Tory MP's majority. Now, here's the thing. If you're a Tory MP who doesn't really care about your constituency and you're just playing your sort of IEA games, right, your Hunger Games, if they are sat on a 20,000 majority, then you won't see them around in the constituency. You won't see them engaging with constituents. They don't care. They've taken your vote for granted. If someone ends up with even a 10,000 vote majority in this election, they're taking your vote for granted for the next parliament. But if you beat them down to a few thousand majority, they will take you seriously, because that's too close. That is too close for comfort. And come the following election, they could easily lose that seat. So, and the other thing is the smaller the majority, because imagine a scenario, you're in a seat, one of these safe-ish seats, and a load of people vote tactically against the Conservatives, but it's not quite enough. So they win 3,000 majority, right? But let's say there was a load of people who stayed at home because they didn't think that Tory MP could be beaten. Well, now they've seen the results, that they were beaten down to a majority of like 3,000. So come the following election, if those people are still minded to vote tactically to keep the Tories out, all of a sudden you could get more people engaging, even though they're no longer the incumbent. So there's always that to balance it out. But in theory, you make them more vulnerable. And then that Tory MP will pay they will pay attention to their local constituency, and they will do their surgeries, because if they don't, they could end up losing at the next election. So there's always a reason to vote tactically. It's not right that people should have to vote tactically, but there is always a reason to do it. Well, it depends on the seat. Obviously, if it's a seat that the Tories have got no chance of winning, then it doesn't matter, does it? Is there such a concept of the one nation Conservative, considering what they've allowed to occur in the last decade? I think there is. I think the problem is that they're just too weak. I think they're spineless. You know, those on the far right are political arsonists. They're vandals, terrorists. So the one nation Tories, they exist. They genuinely hold those views. They fall into the trap that so many people fall into, which is of appeasement. Oh, if we give them this, then they'll be quiet, they'll behave, they'll be happy. No, they'll never be happy. They'll just ask for more. In fact, they'll stop asking, they'll demand. Because that's what's happened. And my perception is they still haven't learned. You know, my perception, and this is only a perception, I can't possibly know, I don't talk to these people. My perception is that the One Nation Tories at the moment are just, they're resigned to losing the election, and they're just hoping to pick up the pieces afterwards. They're just thinking, right, after the election, we're just going to take charge. And, you know, I think they'll struggle because the membership is clearly on the side of the extremists. So I think they'll struggle. But I think that's why you could look at it and think, are there really any such things as a moderate Tory? As you say, when you look at what they've been doing, what they've been voting for, the legislation they've been passing, the legislation they continue to pass. They know it's wrong. The majority of them know it's wrong. They know, you know, they just think they're doing it for the greater good. They're not. They're not doing it for the greater good. They're weak. That's all I can put it down to. They're just weak people. Saffron's a safe seat. What is it called? Walden Saffron, did you say? Should we have a little look? Hold on. I'm not familiar with a lot of these southeast rural seats, if indeed that is where it is. I think it is. Or is it Saffron Walden? Hold on. Go to the S first. Or is it Walden Saffron? I can't see it anywhere. Hold on. I'm blind. No. Am I going to have to do a search here? Oh, I didn't find one. Is it called something else? Is it being called? It must be being called something else. Where's Torbay on that list? Okay, well, that's it. That's easy. Torbay. Conservative hold. The closest for that one would be the Lib Dems. I don't think that's a surprise. The Lib Dems are 5% behind the Tories. So, if you look at the... Oh, no. I've taken it off again. There it goes. So, Torbay... If I zoom in a bit for you. So 32% Conservative. This is vote share on the MRP model, right? 32% Conservative, 22% Labour, 27% Lib Dem. So straight away, given that a lot of tactical voting is going to be on the part of Lib Dem or Labour voters, there's a benefit for others tactically voting as well, but, you know, whether the others want to is another matter. So if there was a lot of heavy tactical voting in this seat, The Lib Dems have only got a 5-point deficit at the moment. So lots of tactical voting there and not a lot of don't knows voting Conservative. Torbay is winnable for the Lib Dems. It's definitely targetable. Right, going back to some of these other questions then. Could Rachel Reeve's decision to not cap bankers' bonuses make Labour complicit in the next banking crash? Can't vote for Labour's disaster capitalism. So, well, there's two things I will say to that. First of all, potentially, I think it's a terrible policy, and it would be different if there was some strategic benefit in it. I see none. It's not going to win votes. It's not a vote winner. You know. In terms of you can't vote for Labour's disaster capitalism, here's the thing. Labour aren't disaster capitalists. They may not be strong enough on regulation at times, but consider the last banking crash, right? It was not as bad because Labour had regulated the banking sector and the Conservatives had opposed those regulations all the way through. Had the Conservatives been in place, that crash would have been worse. It's simple as that. So if you say you can't vote for Labour because they might be being careless, what you're saying is you'd prefer the Tories, who are going to be deliberately reckless, right? It's a bad policy, but it's also a minor policy. It's not going to cause the next banking crisis. It just, if we'd left the cap in, it would have toned down reckless behaviour and therefore muted it a bit. It won't stop it happening. It's not going to help. You're removing a little bit of a velvet rope from it. But it's also one policy. You've got to look at everything. If you get fixated on one policy, then you end up having a situation where you go, there's 100 things Labour are going to do that I approve of and nothing the Conservatives are going to do that I approve of, but because of this one thing, I'm going to let the Conservatives have another crack. That's self-defeating. That is self-defeating. But the policy, just from every angle, seems bad to me. I say seems bad. I still keep trying to think, what could the possible benefit in saying it be? It's not going to... It can only appeal to not just bankers. We're not talking about bankers here. We're talking specifically bankers who earn millions of pounds in bonuses. So we're not talking about someone working at the local NatWest. We're talking about high earning, very, very, very high earning investment bankers. There's not enough votes there. There's not enough votes there. They're not even in parts of the country that Labour really need to win. They're already going to win most of London. Doesn't matter. So it's a complete nonsense electorally. You can't say it's a vote winner. It's not. So therefore, is it something that's going to boost the economy? No, how can it? You can't even say that you'll be able to, because, the financial services sector, the City of London specifically, pays a lot of taxes. So you could say, oh, but, if we unleash that, then that's more taxes. But they're really good at getting out of paying taxes. They're really very good at getting out of paying taxes. So I can only imagine if there is a reason, and I keep meaning to email them to ask, although I probably won't get an answer. If there is a reason at all, I can only imagine that they think that in order to grow the economy, because think about this, Labour are committed to growing the economy significantly, not just like 0.1%, 0.2% rubbish, growing the economy as we would understand it by several percent. In fact, they reckon they're going to get the best growth in the G7 sustained. Good one. So, that's just mathematically not possible. I don't know what that's about, but anyway, it doesn't matter. So then you think to yourself, okay, so investment will yield a return over a long time. So even this £28 billion a year, right, that's not going to deliver an instant return. That is for the long term. In the short term, what can we do? Well, we need to try and reduce our trade barriers. But there's some we can do absolutely really quickly, and there's some we can't. So what else? Well, the financial services sector. So you might imagine they're thinking, we need the financial services sector to power up here and generate a load of growth. That's the only thing I can think. But if that is the thinking, it does seem to me to be playing with fire. That being said, I will say this. Rachel Reeves is an economist. Now, I know Gordon Brown was as well. And, still didn't close all the stable doors before the horses bolted in 2007, 2008. Yeah, I get that. And also Gordon Brown said no more boom and bust. And it's a little bit like you could be forgiven for saying in 2008, Gordon, we had quite a large boom and we seem to have gone bust. What's happened there then? So, but at the same time, I think it is still beneficial to have a chancellor who is at least an economist. But there we go. Are Reeves and Starmer risking austerity light? There is no right austerity. Let's be really clear about what austerity is. Austerity is when you reduce spending. Labour are not going to reduce spending. On no planet, in no timeline, are Labour reducing spending. That's not going to occur. I will bet, as I often say, I will bet my right. In fact, I'll bet my left buttock on that. The left buttock is the good one, right? I will bet my left buttock that when we're having these conversations in a few years' time, Labour have not reduced spending. There will be no austerity. Like, Labour were mad to have even gone along with it in the Miliband years. And as we know, of course, that was based on a miscalculation. Someone produced a financial report where they made a basic error that actually a university student spotted. Well, it's all out the bag now. There is no economic argument for austerity. It's all been blown out the water. And the people in charge of Labour at the moment were the ones who were never in favour of it in the first place. So, actually, I don't know about Yvette Cooper. But at the same time, she's Home Secretary, so she's not going to decide these things. Even the FT was lukewarm about bankers' bonuses. In a way, that might be a good thing, though, because that might suggest that they don't think it's going to make much difference at all. Because I read a couple of articles myself. So it may well... I would be more worried if the FT thought it was a great idea, because it would suggest that it would be a game changer. So the fact that they're thinking whatever, a little bit like trade experts when they talk about joining the CPTPP, whatever, right? We're not that bothered. It's not going to make much difference, right? It's not a bad thing, but it's not really a great thing either. If financiers are taking the same attitude towards the bankers' bonus cap, then that might mean actually it's not expected to have a major impact at all. Remember, there were several measures that were introduced in the wake of the banking crisis. That was just one of them. At the same time, I still see no good reason to have removed it. And so that's why I'm voting Lib Dem here in Torbay. I'm also trying to convince Tory voters who won't switch to a left-wing or centrist party to vote Reform. Hopefully split the right-wing vote. Well, what does it reckon Reform UK will be on? It reckons they're on 11. Again, I still have a sneaking suspicion Reform's vote is being inflated a bit. However, we will wait to see what the by-elections are, because Reform UK are really going for it in Wellingborough. Wellingborough is looking really interesting. I've seen a little bit of sneaky internal polling. Wellingborough looks like a Tory disaster area. It could well be that Labour will be cheering when the by-election results called out, but it could well be that Reform UK are going to be insufferable. At the same time, they are standing in Kingswood as well. So for my money, Reform UK have to deliver a good, strong result in both Wellingborough and Kingswood if they're going to claim that they're going to make a difference. But even if it's just... If they get something like 15% of the vote in Wellingborough, I mean, the Tory papers are going to be like, they're going to be brilliant. One Angry Peg saying, I really hope I'm right on that. I am 100% right on that. I am betting my good buttock on this. Where will Labour get the money from, and should it announce where the money will come from ahead of the next election? So, the reason why they're sounding very, very cautious and coy and non-committal on lots of things that we sort of suspect they are going to fund is because ahead of the election, They have to make sure that all their spending plans are waterproof. The way they're describing it in Labour is bomb-proof. They're making sure every single policy in the manifesto is bomb-proof, that they can all be delivered and that they're all fully costed. Now, here's the thing. Once they're in power, they don't have to do that. As long as by the following election, because ultimately voters, they think for an election, they will judge methods. They will go, oh no, we don't agree that that method's right, okay? But come the following election, as long as you've delivered, what they really care about is results. Labour cannot talk about a record. They can talk about their record in the last government. There's very few of them that were in government then. So they can't really talk about a record. They're talking about a hypothetical set of policies. So at the moment, they're sounding very coy. I think some people are going to be surprised. I mean, you're going to have to wait a few years because remember, even if although they are committing to 2 budgets a year at least, like at the moment we sort of get an autumn budget statement and then we get a budget in March, whereas I think Labour are talking about 2 proper budgets a year, which is interesting. So we'll have to see how that pans out. But generally speaking, in terms of how things are done at the moment, you have your budget in March. So if Labour win power in May, then it's 10 months before they can form their own budget. So they'll spend the first year basically on the Tory budget. Now, it doesn't mean to say all the spending has to be as the Tories would have had it. They can move things around, but it's the Tory budget, right? The Tory tax and spend rules. That's for the first year. But that's okay because for the first year, mostly what they'll be focusing on is legislation. And then in the second year, it will be the first Labour budget. But even that will be, it will be a transition. So you're talking probably the third year before you're starting to see proper full Labour budgets. Unless, of course, this plan of theirs for 2 budgets a year means that they can get into the swing of it more quickly. That'd be interesting. You're a 30-year Labour voter, but not capping banker bonuses at the last straw. You do realise that the party that uncapped it was the Conservatives, and Labour have not said that, Labour have not given the impression that if the cap was in place, they would remove it. They've just said they're not going to put it back. Beyond the regularly touted ones, what other tax loopholes are Labour likely to close that would have big and near immediate payoffs? So because they're not talking about it, I can't possibly say. All I will say is there's believed to be about 200 billion quid a year that people aren't paying in tax avoidance, which is the illegal stuff. No, evasion, sorry, get it right. Tax evasion, which is the illegal stuff. That's not a case of closing loopholes. You don't need to close loopholes to that. They're already breaking the law. You just need to catch them. So what I would hope will happen, I can't possibly know because they've not said. What I would hope will happen is that they will just hire a load more tax inspectors. If you hire more tax inspectors, you will generate more tax. Tax inspectors always make more money than they cost, always. Then, but the other thing to note is that people have been suggesting, those close to Rachel Reeves have been saying she's been doing a lot of studying of how you basically get people to pay their taxes. She's been reading a lot of books on the subject. So she clearly has plans, because here's the thing, Labour aren't going to raise the rate of tax. That will just look bad in the papers. Even if you say to yourself, but if they raise the rate of tax for the wealthy, that's all right. The papers will present it as the rate of tax is going up. They'll just work it out as the rate of tax across the whole population. I certainly would in their position. So they can't raise the rate of tax. Ideally, they need to lower it. They can only make so many cost savings by not giving dodgy contracts to Infosys or other associated Tory mates and donors. Ultimately, what they need is more tax revenue. They do need more taxes coming in. So how do you do that without raising the rates of tax? You just make more people who are getting out of it not get out of it. And so although I don't specifically know what they're going to do, it has to be that. And the easiest way surely is chasing after those who are illegally. You can try and close tax loopholes on avoidance, stuff like that. There are things you can do. I mean, Graham Hughes suggests just send a tax inspector to Eton There's loads of tax fiddles going on there. We know about it. It's open secret. Send a tax inspector and tax them properly. Never mind having them moaning about it. Oh, we're a charity, you know. Oh, you bollocks. Labour cannot let the economy flatline. It's a massive stimulus package to turbocharge the economy. It does need investment. Absolutely needs investment. Now, Labour do have a slight advantage, ironically because of Brexit, in that growth is always measured not in terms of how much your economy is actually growing, but purely in percentage terms compared to yourself. So, for example, if Labour grow the economy by even like £100 billion or something stupid, it'll look like good growth as a percentage because they'll be comparing it with the UK. That's when people compare growth between different countries, but they use percentages, not, it's like, no, if you're going to compare growth between different countries, you do billions of dollars. That's how you compare. They do it with percentages. So it's like, well, you're not comparing then. You like, if we have 3% growth, that and France has 2% growth, that doesn't mean we've got more growth than France. It means the UK economy is 3% larger than the UK economy was last year, and the French economy is 2% more than it was the year before. But if the French economy is higher, it's not actually, but if it were, do you know what I mean? So in order to play the game, all they have to do is be able to generate more GDP. And there are things Brexit sort of gives them a small advantage. It's a big disadvantage, but it's the same. The disadvantage is shared with the Tories, but the advantage is purely Labour's, in that they're not got any ideological further for divergence. So they can just, I mean, you know, the things like the European Mediterranean Convention, Trans-European Mediterranean Convention, we can join that fairly quickly, I think. That'll boost productivity. There's things we can do quite quickly within the first couple of years to remove trade barriers. We've run out of time. Last few questions here. Increasing compliance and enforcement is definitely a good way to go, and there's nothing the average person is less sympathetic to than a rich and blatant tax dodger. Absolutely. For me, and I don't understand why the last Labour government didn't do more. It's low-hanging fruit, isn't it? Don't charge people more tax. Make the people pay the rate of tax that people think they've been, charged. Don't allow, and keep advertising it, saying, this person, you say like an ordinary person, you're paying 33% income tax. 33% of your income is going into tax. This person's getting away with 20% and they're making millions. That's not right. And we're going to tackle it. That would be a vote winner. You get support from the public in doing that. And the Telegraph can bellyache all it likes. You will get public support for that. Next one said, what do I think about applying taxes on accumulated wealth and land and reducing it on income of poor to middling? In terms of wealth taxes, I don't support them ideologically. I do support them at the moment because the problem is that it's gone out of kilter. If you were to sort of redesign society from the bottom up, I wouldn't be in favour of wealth taxes. I would just make sure income tax was being properly applied to everyone. However, there's been too many decades where people have been allowed to accumulate wealth because their income hasn't been taxed properly, that you've now got a lot of wealth nominally attached to the country that's doing nothing. Like, the purpose of taxation in a geeky sense is not for spending, it's to keep the economy moving, it's to keep money moving around the economy. So if that is the purpose, and you've got people who have, there's wealth that, because people are now describing the UK as a poor country with a small number, of very rich individuals and corporations. We are a poor country. In terms of our living standards, we're a poor country. Someone was talking about dentists today, and I explained the last filling. I had a couple of fillings recently. Now, I Rang the dentist the end of August. I had an appointment a few days later. So it's technically into September, right? Appointment a few days later. And they said, yeah, you're going to need... Well, I thought I needed one filling. It turned out I needed two, right? So they said, right, we'll book you in for these fillings. They booked me in just before Christmas. So early September was when I had my teeth checked. Yeah, we need fillings. After mid-December, like latest, mid to late December is when I actually had it. So it's like nearly 4 months later. And I mentioned this in a tweet, and I'm lucky I've got a dentist. I mentioned this in a tweet. And there's people in other countries going, this is crazy. Even in Ireland going, what? Really? I didn't realise it was that bad. So Labour have got a lot of scope for just improving things in a way that people can recognise. Will new Labour MPs have loyalty to stand for winning their seats like the Red Wall Tories had loyalty to Johnson? Possibly. But at the same time, they'll also want to retain those seats. So they'll also be focused on they'll be very focused on what their constituents want unless they're winning a safe seat. Because if you've got an MP who's going to be loyal to you because you won them their seat, then technically that loyalty could disappear if it looks like you'll lose the seat next time. But there we go. Right, we'll have to call it there, I'm afraid. It's we've gone well over. But have a very good evening, everyone. And until next time, I'll see you later.